Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor RyanGLancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, RyanGLancaster.com. Episode 32, P.T. Barnum, Texas, and the Panic of 1837. Pseudo-history commits logical fallacies. Arguments contain errors in reasoning. Here are a few examples of what I'm referring to. False equivalence. For example, Hitler interned European Jews into camps. FDR allowed the internment of Japanese Americans. Hence, FDR committed horrible atrocities just like Hitler did. Presentism is judging historical figures according to the ethical or other standards of today. An example would be saying that Lincoln was an awful person for only wanting to halt the spread of slavery rather than abolish it altogether. Obviously, there were abolitionists at the time, but they remained a radical minority and only differed from Lincoln's views politically instead of morally, as Lincoln detested slavery. Another would be trying to rationalize past phenomena through a contemporary cultural lens. To use Lincoln again, saying that he was gay because he shared a bed with men and wrote letters to male friends with flowery language. I can personally attest to having one shouting match with my cousin in an LA parking garage debating this matter. Misusing the appeal to authority. Citing a scholar adds weight to your argument and does not automatically validate it. Conversely, citing a scholar ought to be an attempt to direct someone to a view based on evidence, not an argument in and on of itself, and certainly not an appeal to authority. Confirmation bias. Very simple, this one. Seeking evidence to validate an already held belief, inviting oneself to absorb affirming or convenient evidence while disregarding countering proof, rather than forming an opinion based on balanced analysis of that evidence. Mistreatment of bias. Chiefly, bias is not necessarily a dirty word. Bias can be beneficial in analyzing a source and should not mean that the reference is discredited or discarded. It just depends on how you end up using that source. It's generally undesired in secondary or tertiary sources, though not entirely useless. Implying correlation equals causation. Well, just because the two quantities are correlated does not necessarily mean one is directly causing the other to change. Correlation does not imply causation, just like cloudy weather does not imply rainfall, even though the reverse is true. Between the years of 1860 and 1940, as the number of Methodist ministers living in New England increased, so did the amount of Cuban rum importers into Boston, and they both increased in an extremely similar way. Thus, Methodist ministers must have brought lots of rum in that period. Actually, no, that's a senseless conclusion to draw. What's going on is that both quantities, Methodist ministers and Cuban rum, were driven upwards by other factors, such as population growth.
P.T. Barnum. Barnum's career was trafficked in curiosities, which he served up to a public hungry for such entertainment, regardless of how accurate or ethical such displays were. His legacy in show business stretched from the American Museum to P.T. Barnum's Grand Traveling Museum, Menagerie, Caravan and Hippodrome near the end of his life. Each was full of bigger-than-life ideas marketed to an audience interested in mass, and often crass, entertainment. As it was generally understood, Barnum wrote the term humbug consists in putting on glittering appearances, outside show, novel expedients, by which to suddenly arrest public attention, and attract the public eye and ear. And Barnum wanted to make it clear such a practice was justified. There are various trades and occupations which need only notoriety to ensure success, he claimed, concluding no harm, no foul, so long as at the end of the day customers felt like they got their money's worth. Growing up in the antebellum North, Barnum took his first natural dip into showmanship at age 25, when he purchased the right to rent an aged black woman named Joyce Heth, whom an acquaintance was trumpeting around Philadelphia as the 161-year-old former nurse of George Washington. By this time, Barnum had tried working as a lottery manager, shopkeeper, and newspaper editor. He lived in New York City, was employed at a boarding home and grocery store, and was hungry for a money-making gimmick. I had long fancied that I could succeed if I could only get hold of a public exhibition, he reflected about his life at the time in his 1855 autobiography, The Life of P.T. Barnum, written by himself. With Heth, he saw an opportunity to strike it rich. Though slavery was outlawed in Pennsylvania and New York at the time, a loophole allowed him to lease her for a year for $1,000, borrowing $500 to complete the sale. It was while on tour with her when he observed a public hungry for spectacle. Human curiosities, freaks of nature, were among the most popular traveling entertainments of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Rees explains in his book. Still, by the time Barnum went on tour with Heth, there was a shift. By the 1830s, the display of grotesquely embodied human forms was for some populist carnivalesque entertainment, and others an offense to genteel sensibilities. So while the Jacksonian press in New York, the vanguard of mass culture, covered Heth's shows breathlessly, he found while following Barnum's paper trail that the more old-fashioned New England press bristled at the display. As the newspaper, the Courier wrote cuttingly, "Those who imagine they can contemplate with delight a breathing skeleton, subjected to the same sort of discipline that is sometimes exercised in a menagerie to induce the inferior animals to play unnatural pranks for the amusement of barren spectators, will find food to their taste by visiting Joyce Heth." Still, with Heth, Barnum proved himself capable of being nimble enough to dip and swerve, playing up different stories of her to appeal to diverse audiences across the Northeast. Heth, of course, was not alive in George Washington's time. Whether Barnum believed the fable frankly doesn't matter. While he later claimed he did, he wasn't above making up his myths about Heth to attract people to see her. He once planted a story that declared the enslaved woman wasn't even a person at all. What purports to be a remarkably old woman is simply a curiously constructed automaton, he wrote. When she died in February 1836, Barnum had one more act up his sleeve rather than let her go in peace. He drummed up a final public spectacle, hosting a live autopsy in a New York saloon. 1,500 spectators paid 50 cents to see the dead woman cut up, revealing that she was likely half her purported age. After Heth, Barnum found several other acts to tour, notably the coup of getting the world-famous Jenny Lind, the Swedish Nightingale, to travel across the Atlantic to make her critically and popularly acclaimed American debut with him, until he became the proprietor of the American Museum in December 1841 in New York. More than 4,000 visitors poured per day to browse some 850,000 interesting curiosities, at the price of 25 cents a trip at the American Museum. The fake and the real blended in the space, with imported, exotic live animals mixing alongside hoaxes like the so-called Fiji mermaid, a preserved monkey's head sewn onto the preserved tail of a fish. Most uncomfortably, in the museum, Barnum continued to present freakishness in the form of living curiosities. One of the most popular displays featured a man billed as a creature found in the wilds of Africa, supposed to be a mixture of the wild native African and the orangutan, a kind of man-monkey. The offensive poster concluded, "For want of a positive name, the creature was called What Is It?" Because of the bipartisan mass audience he built through such displays, which preyed on ideas of African inferiority and racial othering, Barnum then decided to throw his hat into the political ring. During his successful run for the Connecticut General Assembly in 1865, something changed, however. Suddenly Barnum began to express a novel sympathy and regret about the subjugation of African Americans, or at least to approach civil rights matters at the end of the Civil War with a new, somewhat softer vision of racial paternalism. During a failed run for Congress, he even confessed during a campaign speech that while living in the South he had owned slaves himself, actions he since regretted. "I did more," he said. "I whipped my slaves. I ought to have been whipped 1,000 times for this myself. But by then, I was a Democrat, one of those bland Democrats, who are Northern men with Southern principles. With Heth at least, he viewed her as an opportunity and a piece of the property initially, something he bragged about constantly early in his career. But after he gained growing respectability following the Civil War, the story he so proudly boasted about changed. Barnum's great discovery was not how easy it was to deceive the public, but rather, how much the crowd enjoyed being deceived.
The Revolution of Texas. The Texas Revolution, also called the War of Texas Independence, was fought from October 2, 1835, through April 21, 1836. After a decade of political and cultural clashes between the Mexican government and the increasingly American settlers in Texas, the war began. In the end, Texas won, resulting in its independence from Mexico and the founding of the Republic of Texas. When the United States purchased Florida from Spain in 1819, the Spanish and American line on the southwest was fixed by the Sabine River. Just across this line was the District of Texas, then a province of Mexico called Coahuila y Tejas. The Spanish government, anxious to develop this state, offered large tracts of land to anyone who would settle a certain number of families within a definite area. Many Americans took advantage of this offer. Moses Austin of Missouri led a colony of families into the fertile region among the earliest immigrants. It was not long after this that Mexico revolted from Spain and became an independent republic. The government was precarious, and most of the early presidents were tyrannical and usurped many privileges. Among the most successful of these dictators was Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. He succeeded in controlling all of the local state governments except Texas, and made himself so unpopular that many of his enemies moved into the province of Texas. The new laws were unpopular throughout Mexico, leading to violence in several states. Making matters worse for the Texans, Santa Anna removed the capital of Texas from San Antonio to Saltillo, a town in a neighboring state. This caused so much inconvenience that in April 1833, the Texans called a convention to discuss proposed changes in immigration, judicial, and other political policies. The delegates advocated separate statehood for Tejas and elected Stephen Austin, son of the early pioneer, to carry a proposed state constitution to Mexico City. The new Mexican president, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, approved many proposals but refused to separate statehood. Austin returned to Texas but wrote a letter in October that advocated Texans to act unilaterally on statehood. As a result, he was arrested for treason and taken back to Mexico and imprisoned, where he would stay for the next year and a half. In the meantime, the number of Americans and Mexican immigrants entering Tejas was quickly escalating, inspiring Santa Anna to believe that the influx of American immigrants to Texas was part of a plot by the U.S. to take over the region. In 1834, because of perceived troubles within the Mexican government, Santa Anna dissolved state legislatures, disarmed state militias, and abolished the Constitution of 1824. The Texans were so indignant over these changes and the imprisonment of Stephen Austin that they met again, making plans for a revolt. Hearing of this, a garrison of Mexican soldiers attempted to seize a cannon belonging to the defense of Gonzales, Texas, on October 2, 1835. Though the Texans resisted and forced the Mexicans to leave the field, this was the first official battle of the Texas Revolution. Continued hostilities then began that continued for 3 months. During this time, the citizens of Texas met, formally declared war against Mexico, and elected General Samuel Houston, commander of the army. Soon Santa Anna ordered his troops to march upon San Antonio. When William B. Travis, in command of about 150 Texas troops, heard of Santa Anna's approach, leading some 1,500 soldiers, he and his men took refuge at a fortified convent known as the Alamo. He also published a message to the people declaring that he was surrounded by an army far outnumbering his own, and that Santa Anna demanded unconditional surrender. Along with other famous names such as Davy Crockett and James Bowie, Travis resisted the attack that began on February 23 and lasted for the next 12 days. Unfortunately, though Travis wrote multiple letters pleading for more men and supplies, fewer than 100 reinforcements arrived. Many skirmishes occurred as Travis and his men desperately waited for help that would never come. In the early morning hours of March 6, the full force of the Mexican army advanced on the Alamo. As the Texas soldiers fought bravely, they could repulse 2 attacks. However, they could not resist when a third came. In the end, every last man within the Alamo would die, estimated to have been between 182 and 250 Texans. While the Battle of the Alamo was going on, Texas declared its independence from Mexico at a convention on March 1, 1836. Texans appointed 5 delegates to draft the document, completed it overnight, and signed it on March 2. David G. Burnett was made president, and Lorenzo de Zavala was chosen as vice president. Santa Anna continued his campaign, and before General Sam Houston could prevent it, the Mexicans surprised a force under Colonel James W. Fannin at Goliad. They destroyed this garrison in the same brutal manner as in their attack upon the Alamo. Without realizing Houston did not prepare his small army to fight Santa Anna out in the open, he soon ordered a retreat towards the U.S. border, and many settlers also fled in the same direction. Santa Anna's army gave chase. On April 20, 1836, both armies met at the San Jacinto River. Separating them was significant sloping ground with tall grass, which the Texans used as cover. Soon the Mexicans were reinforced, and Santa Anna ordered his men to stand down, sure that the Texans would not attack his superior force. He allowed his troops, who had been stretched by the ongoing forced marches, to rest. However, the next afternoon he and his men were surprised when the smaller force of Texans attacked. In a battle that lasted only about 18 minutes, Santa Anna's entire force was killed or captured by Sam Houston's heavily outnumbered army. Only 9 Texans died. Santa Anna was captured the following day and held as a prisoner of war. 3 weeks later, Santa Anna was released after signing a treaty in which he agreed to discontinue war upon Texas. He was allowed to return to Mexico. These treaties did not specifically recognize Texas as a sovereign nation, but stipulated that Santa Anna lobby for such recognition in Mexico City. Afterward, the United States, France, and England recognized the new republic as independent, though Mexico never did. Sam Houston became a national celebrity, and the Texans' rallying cries, "Remember the Alamo," and "Remember Goliad," became etched into American history and legend. It was not long after the Texas Revolution that the people of the new republic began to consider the annexation of their state to the United States. The majority of the population were Americans, whose interests had always been closely identified with the United States. As soon as this plan became known, England discouraged the idea and attempted to secure better relations between Mexico and Texas. Santa Anna, having already repudiated his treaty, was collecting an army for further invasion. But the biggest issue with annexing Texas as a state was the issue of slavery. The question of annexation was to become a national issue in the United States, where the people of the North and South took definite sides. The abolitionists of the North and East were especially opposed to annexation because Texas was a slaveholding republic. The addition of this vast territory would significantly increase the area of the slaveholding states and retard the chances of abolition. Though President John Tyler and some of his primary supporters were earnest advocates of annexation, he did not publicly make known his plans until April 1844, when he sent a message to the Senate proposing a treaty of annexation. However, the Senate promptly rejected the proposal. The following year, Democratic candidate James K. Polk of Tennessee would become the president. An enthusiastic advocate of annexation, Texas became a state on December 29, 1845, which soon led to the Mexican-American War.
Samuel Colt. In 1836, Connecticut-born gun manufacturer Samuel Colt received a U.S. patent for a revolver mechanism that enabled a gun to be fired multiple times without reloading. Colt founded a company to manufacture his revolving cylinder pistol. However, sales were slow, and the business floundered. Then in 1846, with the Mexican War underway, the U.S. government ordered 1,000 Colt revolvers. In 1855, Colt opened the world's largest private armament factory, in which he employed advanced manufacturing techniques, such as interchangeable parts, and an organized production line. By 1856, the company could produce 150 weapons per day. Colt was also an effective promoter, and by the start of the U.S. Civil War, he had made the Colt revolver perhaps the world's best-known firearm. He died a wealthy man in 1862. The company he founded remains in business today. On July 19, 1814, Samuel Colt was born in Hartford, Connecticut, the son of textile manufacturer Christopher Colt and wife Sarah. By visiting his father's mill in Ware, Massachusetts, and helping out at a nearby farm, the young Colt became interested in all things mechanical and often dismantled objects, including his father's firearms, to discover how they functioned. At age 16, he enrolled at Amherst Academy in Massachusetts to study navigation. However, his youthful hijinks later expelled him. His father then allowed the teen to study navigation firsthand, sending him out to sea on the Corvo, which embarked on a nearly year-long voyage in 1830. Aboard the Corvo, Colt became fascinated with the ship's wheel, particularly the way it could alternately spin or be locked in a fixed position through the use of a clutch. He translated this controlled rotation to firearms, and a means whereby a single-shot pistol could be adapted to fire multiple rounds in quick succession. Colt carved a 6-barrel cylinder, locking pin, and hammer out of wood during his time at sea. Although this prototype for a pistol featured multiple rotating barrels, in later versions, Colt would opt instead for a rotating cylinder containing multiple bullet chambers to reduce the gun's weight and bulk. After returning from his adventure at sea, Colt spent 2 years traveling North America under the name Dr. Colt, hosting a roadshow. He entertained and educated crowds on the uses of nitrous oxide. The profits he saved through his skill as a promoter enabled him to perfect his revolver mechanism, and he hired gunsmiths to create a series of prototypes. Some consider Colt's revolver mechanism more innovative than invention because it improved upon a revolving flintlock, a firing mechanism used in muskets and rifles, already patented by Boston inventor Elisha Collier. The British patent for Colt's mechanism was acquired in October 1835, and on February 25, 1836, the American inventor received U.S. Patent No. 138 for his revolving cylinder pistol. The enhancements listed in this patent include greater facility in loading, changes in the weight and location of the cylinder, which give steadiness to the hand, and the great rapidity in the succession of discharges. Colt's Patent Arms Manufacturing Company began making the Paterson pistol in 1836 at its Paterson, New Jersey, factory using funds advanced by Colt's family. Colt initially produced 3 revolving handguns, belt, holster, pocket pistols, and 2 rifles. All models incorporated a revolving cylinder into which gunpowder and bullets were loaded. The primer was placed on a strike plate outside the cylinder, and combustion was initiated by pulling the trigger and releasing the hammer onto the strike plate. The ability to fire 6 shots without reloading, a task that required 20 seconds using a single-shot firearm, provided a crucial advantage to soldiers and settlers encountering danger in the nation's frontier regions. Colt continued to refine his initial design, obtaining patents on such components as a cylinder locking mechanism, fluted cylinders, more extended grips, and beveled cylinder mouths to eliminate igniting adjacent chambers. A savvy businessman, he retained rights to these patents, making his applications as an individual rather than through the Patent Arms Manufacturing Company. Seeking a government contract for his guns, Colt visited the office of the U.S. Secretary of War. Still, the Army judged using a percussion cap in Colt firearms too innovative and therefore potentially unreliable. Scattered sales in the newly formed Republic of Texas and in Florida, where the Second Seminole War was ongoing, did not translate into the revenue required to maintain the veneer of success Colt needed to impress potential clients. Eventually, the company's shareholders took control of Patent Arms Manufacturing, and Colt was relegated to the sales agent. In 1842, the company was forced to close, and its fixtures and inventory of guns and gun parts were auctioned off to the highest bidder. Colt turned to another interest, with his company failing, perfecting an underwater mine for use in harbor defense. His remote ignition submarine battery required him to develop a waterproof cable capable of transmitting electricity underwater. As with his revolver mechanism, Colt's innovative line was adapted from an earlier design, a cable developed by telegraph inventor Samuel F.B. Morse. The relationship between the two inventors led to a partially implemented scheme to install a telegraph line from the New York Merchants Exchange to Sandy Hook, New Jersey. Busy with these new projects and discouraged by the failure of Patent Arms Manufacturing, Colt also found himself caught up in a national scandal after his brother, John Colt, murdered a printer with whom he did business. The 1844 election of President James K. Polk saw Polk's plans for outward expansion into Texas and the Western Territories. Colt submitted a sample of his enhanced revolving holster pistol to the U.S. War Department, seeing a new opportunity. In 1846, with the Mexican War underway, Colt visited Captain Samuel H. Walker of the U.S. Mounted Riflemen. After Colt and Walker collaborated on designing a new and improved gun, General Zachary Taylor ordered 1,000 Colt revolvers. The guns were delivered to the Army in 1847. Colt's guns were now produced in Hartford, where mechanic-minded supervisor Elisha K. Root managed his factory. Under Root's guidance, the renamed Colt Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company hired talented mechanics and engineers who continued the innovations Colt had begun. In the early 1850s, a company branch was established in England, and in 1855 a new Hartford factory, the largest privately owned armament manufacturing plant in the world, was built overlooking the Connecticut River. By 1856, the company could produce 150 weapons per day using interchangeable parts, efficient production lines, and specially designed precision machinery. The Colt brand was now recognized worldwide through savvy promotion and was associated with quality and dependability. A masterful promoter, Colt positioned his firearms within the American mythos, even hiring artist and explorer George Catlin to create paintings depicting Colt guns used by sportsmen and explorers encountering exotic predatory animals in North and South America. During the late 1850s, while tensions mounted between the North and South soon led to the American Civil War, Colt continued to do business with long-standing customers in southern states. However, when war was finally declared on April 12, 1861, he focused almost exclusively on supplying the Union Army. He also outfitted the 1st Regiment Connecticut Rifles, a volunteer regiment from his company's home state. Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company operated at total capacity and employed over 1,000 people in its Hartford factory. By that time, Samuel Colt had become one of the wealthiest men in America and owned a Connecticut mansion called Armsmere. The strain of supplying the war effort eventually took its toll on Colt. Suffering from chronic rheumatism, the 47-year-old gun manufacturer died at his home on January 10, 1862, leaving behind an estate worth millions. The company, which manufactured more than 400,000 firearms during Colt's lifetime, was left to its founder's wife, Elizabeth, and Root was appointed president. In 1901, the Colt family sold the company to a group of investors. Still in business today, the Colt's manufacturing company produced the Colt single-action Army handgun, also known as the Colt 45 or the Peacemaker, the standard service revolver of the U.S. military between 1873–1892. The company founded by Samuel Colt has produced more than 30 million pistols, guns, and rifles.
Panic of 1837. The Panic of 1837 was a financial crisis that had damaging effects on the national economies. Following the War of 1812, the United States government recognized the need for a national bank to regulate the printing of currency and the issuance of government bonds. Many in the U.S. public opposed the Bank of the United States, believing that it limited their ability to make land purchases and pay off other debts. Jackson had opposed banks since the 1790s when he lost a sizable amount of money when he invested his money in a bank. In 1816, the United States government had authorized the bank to operate for 20 years. In 1832, Nicholas Biddle, the head of the Bank of the United States, asked to have the institution rechartered. Biddle, at the urging of Henry Clay, applied for rechartering 4 years early. Congress agreed with the necessity for a national bank, but President Jackson vetoed the bill. His action, in essence, prevented the continued existence of the Bank of the United States after 1836. Jackson was not happy with waiting until 1836 for the Bank of the United States to end. In 1832, Jackson ordered the withdrawal of federal government funds, approximately $10 million, from the Bank of the United States. The president deposited these funds in state banks and privately owned financial institutions known as pet banks. Ohio had 9 of these banks. Biddle tried to keep the national bank operational by calling in loans, yet many businesses did not have the funds to pay off their debts. As a result of Biddle's actions, numerous companies had to close their doors due to the lack of funds during 1833 and 1834. After this brief economic downturn, the United States economy boomed. State banks began loaning money to industrialists and farmers. The banks also began printing excessive amounts of currency. This action led to high inflation. At the same time that banks were printing currency and loaning out large sums of money, foreign governments and businesses, hoping to benefit from the United States' burgeoning economy, loaned large sums of money to U.S. business people. As a result of all of these factors, high inflation resulted. The currency quickly depreciated. In July 1836, Jackson issued the Specie Circular. Under this act, the government would only accept gold or silver in payment for federal land. Foreign investors also did not want to get U.S. currency as payment, and they began to call in their loans to U.S. businesspeople before the currency depreciated further. U.S. citizens rushed the banks to withdraw the necessary funds to pay off their debts. Unfortunately, many banks had loaned out too much money and did not have sufficient reserves on hand to meet the demands of their customers. Approximately 800 banks closed their doors in 1837, stifling economic growth and bankrupting numerous businesses, including many of the banks. During the Panic of 1837, approximately 10% of U.S. workers were unemployed at any one time. Mobs in New York City raided warehouses to secure food to eat. Prominent businessmen, like Arthur Tappan, lost everything. Churches and other charitable organizations established soup kitchens and bread lines. In Ohio, many people lost their entire life savings as banks closed. Stores refused to accept currency in payment of debts, as numerous banks printed unsecured backed by neither gold nor silver money. Some Ohioans printed their own money, hoping business owners would accept it. Thousands of workers lost their jobs, and many businesses reduced other workers' wages. It took until 1843 before the United States economy truly began to recover. The federal government's failure to assist the U.S. public led voters to turn against the Democratic Party, the party in control of government at the start of the Panic of 1837. In 1840, voters elected William Henry Harrison, a member of the Whig Party, and an Ohioan, over the Democratic candidate.
Elijah P. Lovejoy. Elijah P. Lovejoy, an abolitionist printer, was killed by a mob of slavery supporters when he was trying to protect his shop from its third destruction. Besieged but defiant, Elijah P. Lovejoy and his friends guarded the new printing press inside a riverfront warehouse. A mob surged toward them. Everybody had weapons. "Burn them out," someone outside shouted. "Shoot every damned abolitionist as he leaves." When men with torches climbed onto the roof, defenders of the press opened fire, killing one rioter and forcing others to retreat. In the eerie quiet, editor Elijah P. Lovejoy stepped outside for a look. 5 shots riddled him. "Oh God, I am shot," he said as he fell. Lovejoy, known for righteous and unforgiving prose against slavery, was almost 35 when killed on November 7, 1837. The mob tossed his press into the Mississippi River. It was the 4th press that Lovejoy had lost to people who hated his words. He soon became a martyr to the nation's small but rising wave of abolitionism. In Illinois, a young lawyer named Abraham Lincoln decried the mob violence. Lovejoy, a native of Maine, drew public wrath in St. Louis in 1833 as editor of a Presbyterian newspaper. His object of vituperation was Catholicism. He soon expanded his list of targets to include the Irish and pro-slavery Christians. The city's slave-holding leadership wasn't amused. On April 28, 1836, the final break came when a mob dragged a free black man from the St. Louis jail and burned him to death on a tree near 10th and Market Streets. The victim was Francis L. McIntosh, a steamboat cook who had stabbed a sheriff's deputy to death after being arrested in a scuffle on the levee. Lovejoy's observer described the lynching by fire as an awful murder and savage barbarity. It published gruesome details as local leaders sought to bury the story. The Observer attacked Judge Luke E. Lawless, an old adversary, whose instructions to the grand jury virtually assured no charges would be filed. And there weren't. On July 21, a mob ransacked Lovejoy's office at 85 Main Street beneath today's Gateway Arch. He moved to Alton, but vandals there tossed his press into the Mississippi. Lovejoy obtained another one and resumed attacks on slavery. On August 21, 1837, a mob wrecked his second press. Lovejoy ordered another, which arrived on September 21, and promptly was tossed into the river. 6 weeks later, Lovejoy was murdered defending yet another replacement. He died outside Winthrop Gilman's warehouse at the foot of William Street in Alton. The St. Louis Commercial, a pro-slavery newspaper, lamented accurately that every abolitionist in the land would celebrate Lovejoy's martyrdom. Buried secretly in Alton, his remains were moved in 1865 to the old Alton City Cemetery. A 97-foot monument dedicated in 1897 towers near his grave.
You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm RyanGLancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.